You're up.
You're on right now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 6th broadcast of State of the Arts. I thought it was the 7th, but it's not. It's the 6th. This is a Facebook Live event that explores the humanities and social sciences here at Memorial University. It's a monthly program where we chat with a variety of faculty members about their work and about issues that they address through their teaching and research, and about that have to do with a critical understanding of where we are in the world right now, which I would say is where we need some critical understanding. My name is Lisa Moore. I'm a writer, a visual artist, and an associate professor in Memorial's English department. I would like to thank Janet Herron and Benjamin Dugdale. Benjamin's a graduate student who's helping us technically here, and Janet is the producer, researcher, and brains behind the operation. I am very pleased to introduce our guest, Dr. Trevor Bell, who is a professor in the Department of Geography. Trevor is a multidisciplinary geographer and university research professor whose current work focuses on climate change impacts and human-environment interactions. His pioneering research on climate variability and change in the coastal Arctic has had significant scholarly, community, and policy impacts. He has twice received the Arctic Inspiration Prize for knowledge to action plans that benefit Arctic peoples. And his most recent partnership, Smart Ice, has been recognized by the United Nations. And that's for novel climate solutions. So thank you, Trevor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So we're gonna talk about as much as we can jam pack into this show. I want to start with the fact that you came to Newfoundland as an international student from Ireland, and you decided to stay. And that is something people do, but why did you do it? Why did you stay?
Why did I come here in the first place? It will be interesting. Academics was never part of my life plan. Didn't even know it existed. I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and probably in my broader family. And so I think it's interesting for students to know that sometimes academic careers are not planned out, they just happen. For me, it happened because I applied to a range of universities in North America, and Memorial was the only one who offered me a living expense of $5,000 a year, which I lived on for, I shouldn't really say this, but I did my master's in 3.5 years, which is really bad, because I also worked at the old grad house and spent too many mornings watching the sun coming up. Why did I leave Ireland? It's a similar story to here, maybe. It was the 80s. It was a very dark period in Irish economy at that time, and my entire university class left Ireland. It was a situation, last person out, please turn off the lights.
Yeah,
that literally was it. So I was traveling. I was traveling to study, and so happened upon this island. Nobody knew about this island at that time. And I think since then, of course, the relations between Ireland and Newfoundland are much stronger. But at that time, I accepted the offer. I should never disclose this as a geographer. I accepted the offer to come here, and then took out an atlas to see where it was.
That's awesome. Well,
and
yes.
that really defines also a little bit of my academic career. I follow my heart, my intuition, and I don't really plan a lot of things out. And that really, and that has been lucky for me, some people might say, but I would have to say that I've had great mentors in my career. And
tell me who your mentors are.
Well, Priscilla Enough, the late Priscilla Enough, was an incredible mentor, and John Jacobs, Tom Sheldon, so people within the university, people from outside the university, and I think that mixture has, propelled me forward. And I think also you cannot do what I do and not acknowledge your family, who, when my kids were growing up for the last 25 years, don't see me. Just like this semester, I'm hardly here.
So can you tell me about your work with Priscilla?
It grew out of the fact that research I spent my graduate research career in the high Arctic, the tip of Ellesmere Island, very remote places, in small one-person tents out on the vast tundra of the high Arctic and exploring landscape sort of studies. When I graduated and came to Memorial, it was a time when there was no really research money for going north. As you know, it's very, very expensive. My last plane ticket for my last trip that I just got back from was over $10,000. It's quite alarming. Anyway.
How long were you there for?
2 weeks. So when we came here, I had to explore all new avenues. So I helped Priscilla when I was a graduate student here do some paleo-environmental work, and so we came back and renewed that sort of relationship. But here I came back as a actually initially as just a contract faculty member. So I actually was on contract here for 5 years, long before I ever got a tenure track position. So we sat down and sort of re-explored some of those ideas and started thinking about not just the landscape, but people on that landscape and how landscape change affected prehistoric peoples. And we worked together for the best part of 2 decades. And what I didn't realize for most of that time was that what we were doing here was cutting edge around the world. It took a while to realize that the way we were working and the way we were trying to reconstruct and conceive that landscape that people walked on wasn't being done anywhere else until we started to get this sort of feedback, and people wanted us to publish in these journals, and then people wanted to copy what we were doing. So it was quite an eye-opener for me anyway.
So when you say that it was cutting edge, are you talking about because of the location? Are you talking about the tools you were using? How was it cutting edge? What were you doing that was new?
We were combining the knowledge of a changing landscape with people on that landscape. So recognizing and acknowledging that changes in the landscape affect the behavior, subsistence, and economy of ancient peoples. And so not alone is climate change today impacting migration patterns, subsistence patterns, economies around the world. It did in the past in the sense of how people lived. They moved. As the climate changed and as resources changed, they moved. And you can see the move across the landscape when you're able to reconstruct and date where they were living and why they were living and how they were living. And what's also interesting is that we discovered the first impact of those peoples on the landscape. So we believe, in processing seal skins, were actually causing a change in the local ponds that they lived next to. And we recorded that shift using proxy indicators. Probably one of the earliest recognitions of that in North America. That was 2,000 years ago. People were altering their landscape.
That is amazing.
Gotta get your head around
that's
that.
amazing to think about. Your work recently has moved toward, correct me if I'm wrong, how people are changing the landscape now and how that is affecting the way they're living on the landscape. Would you say that's true?
I think it's shifting towards working with and working for people who live in the north, Indigenous groups that live in the north, primarily Inuit. I, like many scientists in my early career, spent time going through community airports, not really getting out of the airport, shifting planes and off you go. And only when I started to work in this province with Priscilla and then working in Labrador did you get to spend time with Inuit on the land. In fact, when I did all the glacier work up in the Torngats, I had Inuit from Nain and Hopedale walk with me up onto those glaciers and tell the stories of them and what those glaciers meant to them. And ironically, their name for glaciers translates into never melting ice. And I was studying and revealing just how rapidly they were melting. And so it was, it was interesting about even their discussion about going to drink water from the meltwater from those glaciers, how it tasted different, and there was lots of reflections on that. But then I also got drawn into the communities and understanding their perspectives. And over the last decade or so, I've been shifting that work then away from, you'd have to say that I always have had a leaning towards solution-oriented research. Yes, I've done all the curiosity-driven research and published the papers, but the real impact is when you can have an effect on people's lives. And that's the sort of work that I'm focused on now. I'm dedicating the last decade of my career to doing that. Still publish the papers, but 150% of my time is now devoted to that.
So you're working with policy makers, you're working with Indigenous or Aboriginal people, you're working with I guess all of that work, all that research that you've done about the most recent ice age, and all of that is coming to bear on stuff that's happening in the Arctic now.
I would have to say that if you really wanted to ask me to describe it, it's really working with the people.
Okay.
To be honest, not alone is there not a file in the filing cabinet of any community in the north that says recent ice age. There isn't a file in there with a label on called climate change. What you find on those files is homelessness, poverty, suicide, mental health. So it's really hard to go into those communities and not be impacted by that and not want to be motivated to help that. And you might say, well, you're not a social worker, you're not a nutritionist. Anybody who says that is totally wrong. I can help, and everybody else can help by doing what you know to do. So you start to ask about what are the research priorities of the community, and then saying, how can I impact that? So in working with Inuit in Labrador, I contributed to the Going Off Growing Strong program, which is helping to youth at risk in these communities. And you might say, well, what's my perspective on that? It doesn't matter. You do what you can. So you apply for funding, you write reports, you work with people in there. I work on housing. I'm not an architect. I'm not, I don't look at housing from different social perspectives. I do what I can to help bring new housing initiatives to light and raising those questions. And so if people ask me what have I learned in the last 10 years, it's to listen.
Okay, I want to ask you, what have you heard? Can you think of a time when, because we're talking in the university all the time about acknowledging other knowledge forms, other perspectives on knowledge. When you're talking with Inuit people, have you ever had like a completely astonishing revelation or epiphany that come at a problem from a completely different perspective?
Right now I can't think of anything, because it's just a whole learning experience when you're in the communities. Now or 10 years ago, every time you go up there and every time you sit with any other Indigenous group, or even any other, even in rural Newfoundland, just working with people and listening to them, you get a perspective. And especially if you don't bring always that sort of academic sort of filter or perspective on it, you listen to what they're saying. So to me, I think it's important for the university and faculty within the university and researchers within the university to listen to what Indigenous communities are saying, which is we want to be and have the capacity to do research ourselves in our own communities, and we want to do it on the research priorities that are affecting us. Yes, it's really important to study ocean acidification in the world, and it's not that they're not interested in that, and it's not that they have some effect on the oceans on which these Indigenous groups rely on. But it's really hard to focus on that when you're hungry and when you don't have a home to go to, and you don't have a table on which to do your homework. So you think about all the issues around Aboriginal and Indigenous education in this country and new policies, but you go into a community and you realize one of the barriers is literally, having a home that you can call home to do your homework, to build on what you have in the community. Those are the revelations for me, and realizing that you cannot approach each of these issues separately. It's all connected. So when you think of mental health, when you think of food insecurity, when you think of permafrost thaw, you need to look at those in an intersection, a holistic way, because the solutions have to be holistic. So you cannot, if you want to improve mental health, you need to look at housing. You need to look at, and that's affected by landscape change. And housing impacts people's ability for education. So they're all interlinked, and therefore you need to look at these. You can't just find solutions to one thing, because that's not going to deal with the whole issue. So when university researchers typically go up north, they're saying, oh, I'm studying this one thing. And the community is trying to tell them through stories, through Inuit knowledge, that you can't just study that on its own, you need to study everything. And so, I think it's very hard, and if you spend time listening to Inuit, for instance, to not hear about the social inequalities between people, Canadians living in the north and Canadians living in the south. The differences are sometimes greater than Canada and going to a developing country. I mean, what other countries in the world have the outbreaks of TB among their communities like what we have in Canada? And I go into those communities and everybody's on the medication, and there's the clinics, and you realize it's how much it's impacting, and fortunately children are dying of TB in our communities in Canada. How can we not think about how do we affect that? How do we affect change?
I first became aware of your work when I saw the opinion piece you wrote about Muskrat Falls and methyl mercury. So you said, I think, well, why don't you tell me what you said?
My goodness, that seems like such a long time ago. I know it isn't. I mean, that it really came out of the frustration of working with the provincial government, working with NALCOR, not with them, but in meetings, and realizing that they really weren't appreciating the perspective that was coming from the Nunatsiavut, or understanding it. And there really is, there's a second opinion piece that I need to write, which is really reaching out to the university and saying, look at the value of independently researched work can affect policy. And so don't be afraid of doing that work, and continue to do it. I mean, it's also a reflection on the Tri-Councils who funded part of our work, and ArcticNet who funded part of our work in Lake Melville, that then was allowed to be independent of the consultants that were doing work in Lake Melville and showed a completely different perspective. Once again, taking an holistic view, not just simply answering a question that NALCO wanted their consultants to answer. I also, when I think of that time, I think of sitting in those meetings between the government and the Aboriginal groups in Labrador till 2 o'clock in the morning up on the hill, and not being directly in those meetings but being there and advising all of those leaders about what was going on, and once again hearing the words, but now looking back at that and what's happening now, realizing that even now it's hard for Aboriginal leaders to trust what governments say. I mean, I think it's been a year of frustration for many of them. I know I was invited to be a member of the expert science panel that advised the independent expert advisory group who made those recommendations, and still, as far as I know, there's been no response to clearing and some of the mitigation measures that would go on. And it's incredibly frustrating for Inuit who in themselves invested huge amounts of their own time, but their own money into the research, the only research that was put forward to look at that bigger picture. And I think there's an interesting paper that just came out from the Harvard group, and I need to acknowledge that a lot of that research was done by the Harvard group, Elsie Sutherland and some of our other students, but it really looks at the fact that food advisories are not an option as a mitigation measure in Indigenous communities anywhere across the North, and that as we look towards hydroelectric development across the North, that this is going to be, in certain circumstances, because of the high organic matter that's in the soils and the fact that you flood those soils, you are going to produce metal mercury. And the fact that if you have people living downstream, there is going to be an impact on their health. And how big or small that impact is sometimes, who is it for a whole series of white-haired guys sitting in a room up on the hill here to say how much is tolerable, how much can they take of metal mercury in their food system? That is not their decision. Not when you consider that, this is Labrador Inuit have a land claim settlement, and that is impacting part of that settlement area. So, as I wrote in that column and subsequent stories in newspapers, I mean, it violates their international Indigenous rights, and ultimately that is, when we look back on this, just like right now we're looking back through the NALCO inquiry, we're looking back at decisions that were made a decade ago, 15 years ago. Potentially we're in 10 or 15 years we'll look back and say, how did we let that happen?
And I want to ask you this, you brought up that interesting word, independent study, and we at Memorial are here to provide what I would imagine is independent study. So thank you, first of all, for doing that work, for going there and using your position at Memorial to explore these issues that are super important. How was your work received? Because I believe that there is a culture around Muskrat Falls of silence, a desire for silence about the difficult, ugly truths that we're learning about daily as the inquiry goes on.
What do you mean by how was it received? By who?
By anyone, by everyone, by the public, by your colleagues, by the university, by the government. Well,
by the response I got in the communities, that was really strong, because there's incredible lot of interest, and mostly because of the clarity you bring to this. I think sometimes you get experts or you get governments who like to maybe either purposely or not obscure the facts. So just some plain talking. I mean, for me, a real turning point was I think I did an interview on VOCM where people were stopping their cars on the Labrador Highway and texting me saying, because I apologize, I forget the name of the interviewer now.
Paddy Daly?
It could have been Paddy because I'd been on the show a couple of times, but he just said, I'm going to let you talk. And I talked for 30 minutes and didn't get interrupted. And I just laid it out. And it was probably the only time anybody had ever taken the time in words that the communities could understand and reflect on. I didn't, like individual people in university, the same people, whether it was around the soil lead issue here in St. John's, those people emailed me and said, thank you for doing that. You know, I think there were a lot of opportunities for the university to jump in, but I think people are hesitant, and I would not say that it's something you should do blindly, because I mean, I learned a lot from the St. John's lead study about the complexity of communication and the complexity of working with government. And if we had time, I could tell you a bit more about that, because that builds on my confidence to be able to stand up and talk about Muskrat Falls. I made mistakes before. I try not to make mistakes a second time, and so that allowed me to be able to be aware. But also you have to take a position, and you have to say, the science is this, and this is what you need. And I also, though, I would have to say it was my encouragement to go forward is from sitting in communities and looking at those social, economic contexts and realizing how, I don't know what the exact English word is, you correct me, disempowered, unempowered context for those communities. I mean, and so a lot of my research now is about empowering those communities with knowledge, whether it's around, you know, with the Smart Ice program, it's around giving them the tools, giving them a voice, giving them the opportunity to sort of adapt to what's happening in the world today.
And can you talk about it? Can you talk about the Smart Ice project? Because that's an exciting, powerful innovation as well.
I believe it is, and what we're doing is literally doing what I just said. I mean, for Inuit living across the Canadian Arctic, I mean, their identity, their culture, their food comes from the ice, this sea ice. So I've just come from Arctic Bay and Resolute Bay and Pond Inlet. The ice, the ocean surface is frozen already, and it will stay that way till June or July next year. The normal year is for the ice to be on the ocean. It's to be a frozen ocean. It's the extension of the land. But unfortunately, climate change and changing environment is thinning that, making it unpredictable, and they've experienced unprecedented changes. So it was interesting. Hioiken in Alaska did a study to look at sea ice along the north slope of Alaska, and he looked at the trend of changing ice, how it's forming much later every year, how it's melting back earlier every year, and he took those two trend lines, and somewhere in 2050 no ice will form.
Wow, that's really close. That's really close.
It's really close, and you know, you, maybe not me, you and your viewers may witness the demise of that culture in their lifetime because of climate change. I'm not saying that can happen in all parts of, because right now we've 9 months of ice formation, and some parts of the Canadian North will, even under warm circumstances, will form winter ice because the sun goes down below the horizon and it gets very cold. But in the southern areas like Labrador, there could be times when that ice won't form. And who are you? when your name is so, if your translated name is people of the ice, if you like, and your life and identity and culture is connected with sea ice, and there is no sea ice, who are you then? It's very much also like Muskrat Falls. If your diet and who you are, and it's country food is not just food, it's not just calories, it's not just nutrition, it's part of identity. Whether you are from Nunatsiavut, Nunaturavut, doesn't matter. It's part of your identity, and going to the act of going to fish, the act of going to harvest, going to hunt, is part of who you are. If you're told you can't do that anymore because there's metal mercury in it, or because you can't get out on the ice to harvest, then who are you?
Well, Trevor, we have to cut it short now because I have to go teach.
Okay.
But thank you so much for all the work that you've done. It is, really inspiring and important. I'm really grateful for this conversation.
Thank you. I'm happy to come back again.
Okay, well, I'll have you back for sure if you're willing. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, everyone.